Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of One Week Critiques interview series. We interview writers looking at their process from initial draft to final product. And I am Matthew Schmidt, and joining me today is the poet Hannah Dow, the author of Rosarium, which came out on Acre Books in 2018. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Matthew. It's good to be here.
Excellent. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your art?
Sure. I'm a poet. I'm from New Hampshire originally. I grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I'm currently residing in Northwest Arkansas and teaching in Missouri. And as you mentioned, I published my first book of poems, Rosarium, 2 years ago. And I'm currently working on a new manuscript that I'm tentatively calling Cuttings. And that is, I think, engaging with some similar themes to the first book, but also a little bit more personal, familial. And I think that the poem that we're going to talk about today is a good representation of what this one's all about. So.
Good. Well, so today we are going to talk about My Mother Tries to Teach Me How to Garden, and I am going to bring that up on the screen so our readers can see it. All right. If you would please, when you're ready, read us the first draft.
Sure. My mother tries to teach me how to garden. On Saturdays, we knelt too. I watched you make holes, then fill them with the seeds you carried like communion. If these ever grew into anything beautiful, I never noticed. Instead, I confused impatience for impatience, as if you'd been burying shortcomings in your garden. Once you confessed you were not a patient woman. To no one's surprise, I grew up and became not a patient woman. To no surprise, the root of impatience is impatient, named for seed pods that burst open if touched. Irritated by anything that slips through my fingers, I never learned to make with my hands, only to marvel at the way gardens can bloom in the footprint of a field or flowers from a fractured sidewalk. And here, so far from anything I call home, a whole grove flourishes inside an abandoned building, like a greenhouse that has shaken off its glass, like the most beautiful thing I have seen.
Thank you. So, as you said, this is coming from your tentative new book. Why did you choose this particular poem as being representative of work that's going to come out in that book?
Yeah. Admittedly, this poem, I don't know if struggled is the right word, but I remember the revision process of this poem better than perhaps any other. And I think it's maybe because reading the first draft now feels a little cringy, but I think that this poem feels representative of the collection that I've been working on, because it's very invested in this relationship between a speaker and her mother, and between the speaker and place. And it feels kind of like a beginning and a departure from maybe the situation of my life, which is having lived in one place for a long time and then grown up and then left, and kind of been, I've been grappling with the ideas of home and belonging ever since then, and moving all around the country and never really returning to the place I consider to be home or have considered to be home. And so now I'm, not really sure what home means, but I feel like this poem is representative of that for me.
So, where have you lived, like all the places besides New Hampshire? Could you just list those off?
Sure. I went to college in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which, college, so it's not quite the same as living in a place if you go home in the summer. But and then after college, I moved to Los Angeles, and then from there, I was there for 2 years, and then I moved to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and I was there for 3 years, and I moved back to Southern California and lived kind of in the Irvine, Newport Beach, Orange County area for the last 3 years. And then just a month ago, I moved to Northwest Arkansas to work in Missouri, which is itself a weird place because I can kind of identify regionally where each other place I've lived belongs to, but currently I'm not really sure. You know, Northwest Arkansas doesn't feel at all like the South. It feels like more like I don't know, the Pacific Northwest or something. Or maybe parts of the Carolinas that I just haven't really seen that I've heard of. And then Missouri is kind of the Midwest, but also feels a little bit like the South too. So, but yeah, so I've kind of been on every coast, kind of been all over.
Excellent. So your first draft that we just looked at is much different, like you say, from the final version. It moves away from the spacing and what I would call the stair-step form in that first poem to stanzas. Could you just talk a little bit about how you thought about form and worked through it in your revision? And how do you finally land on the stanzas poem?
Yeah, I think that since publishing my book, a lot of the poems that I've been writing have been attempts to try to get away with something I know I shouldn't get away with. And so I think that not just the form, but maybe some of the word choice or, you know, a recent resistance to end on an image. Like I'm kind of trying to break all the rules that I was taught in poetry and trying to see if I can get them to work. And so I think not that, you know, that this form is breaking any rules per se, but it's definitely not something that I don't typically write in a form like this. I think most of my poems are traditionally written in stanzas. And so I think I was just attempting to see what a poem would look like if I could, you know, kind of shake things up and add some space in between the lines and make it move across the page a little bit more. And then I think in revision, I realized that the form wasn't necessarily doing anything for the poem. And I kind of tried to let the poem tell me where it wanted to go in terms of form. But I think I revised the kind of the content of the poem before I revised the form. I think that the stair-step stanzas or lines, that was kind of the last thing to change. I think I tried other forms too. I think I tried tercets, but I revised the content of the poem and then realized that maybe the form wasn't doing, you know, very much for it. And I wanted to, I felt like it was calling too much attention to itself. And so I kind of swapped it out for those traditional stanzas and grouped them kind of according to what my mind was meditating on at a particular moment in the poem, and then attempted to kind of make those units of thought end surprisingly and also be connected to what came after.
Yeah, it's interesting how poems seem to talk to us in a strange way, just how we think about what it is we've tried to say or what it is that kind of came out when we were writing. And, you know, one of the things that I noticed the poem does in the final draft is that it, as you said, you know, you change the content first, and some of that content has to do with gardening. And it gets a bit more specific. You look at the roots of words, you utilize floral diction, such as anther and filament. In what ways does argot or the specialization of language open a poem's possibilities? And how do you decide between using more direct colloquial language versus using like specific terminology in a given poem?
Mhm. I think one of the other reasons that the revision process of this poem is especially memorable to me is that I got to work with two major poetry superstars on this poem. So I got to workshop this with Natalie Diaz and then have a one-on-one meeting with Marilyn Nelson at the Sewanee Writers Conference. So this poem had like a lot of stellar attention. And so I specifically remember, Natalie was often kind of encouraging me to try not to be so like, I don't know, not flowery, but like try to make my language more ugly is how I would summarize. She never said that, but if I were to interpret or read between the lines, I think she was trying to press me to use words that made me feel uncomfortable. And so, and I remember that, Marilyn Nelson's overall comment was kind of like, you need to figure out what this poem is about, because it was kind of trying to take on a lot of different things in the first draft. And I think that the specific terminology might have helped me to kind of narrow in on, the idea of, language and the root of language, I think is what opened up the poem for me to become, I think, right, that was the root of garden is enclosure. And I think I'm quoting from the new draft. That to me became the kind of the driving force of the poem that I was trying to get at, right? This idea of leaving home. And so the roots of the words, I think, is kind of what opened up the poem to become more focused. And I think in a way too, just using like really precise or specialized language, I think is one way of kind of maybe heeding that age-old poetry advice of telling the universal through the particular. Like I think if you have something in a poem that you can really grab onto and not kind of glaze over, it makes you stop and actually consider what the poem is telling you, and maybe becomes more, in a sense, more relatable, even if you don't know what the word means. Upon first reading, there's something that can be taken away from that because it causes you to pause and to think. So I think that's kind of what I was working with here.
Yeah, the particular, I think the particular is something you do particularly well. And, almost to the point of, making me jealous, because I think you write really great short poems. And I think that's one of the most difficult things to do. So like, is there a secret? Like, how do you write really good short poems?
I thank you. I think honestly, just having a short attention span, or being impatient. I think that is the key, because that's also what the poem is about. I think that I just have I have a hard time writing long poems, and I wish I could write more long poems, because then I would have a book sooner. But no, I'm just kidding. But I really liked this question because it kind of made me think of, well, maybe my poetic process is like being a hummingbird. Like I think I kind of dart around between poems, and I don't like to spend too much time working on, or I can work on something for a long time, but only in one sustained effort. Like, and then I have to move on to the next thing, and it's really hard for me to go back to things. So I feel like I can suspend myself in the air for enough time to kind of let something happen and be hyper focused on a single thing, but then I have to kind of dart off to the next to the next idea really quickly. So I'm not sure if that's like a special a skill or something worth coveting, but I think that's just how I work. So I mean, I guess a poem, right? A poem has to have some amount of precision within it, and a longer poem can take its time getting there, and a shorter poem just has to get there. And so knowing that, I think, knowing that I can't write longer poems, I just have to get there, and I find a way to do it, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the hummingbird, I like the hummingbird analogy because like when you see a hummingbird somewhere, unless they're at a feeder or something, it's like a very quick, span of time where you see them, but they're like quick and beautiful, and then they're just gone.
Mhm.
and they're so fast you can't hardly see their wings. I don't know. But I think that's you know, a great way to describe some of your short work. You know, I don't know that it necessarily means that you should covet it or something. I just think it's a skill that not everyone has, and so it's neat to think about and try to work towards, you know, writing shorter poems. Like for me, I feel like sometimes I just kind of go on, and I'm like, when you go back and revision, it's like, oh, I got to cut all this stuff because all this, you know, other ancillary information came in that, you know, isn't really pertinent to this particular poem. And the hummingbird is also, I think, interesting in that you've lived a lot of places, particularly since beginning college. And I think your work focuses a lot on landscape. And like in Rosarium, you have postcard poems, you have poems about growing up in New England, poems about the South and how that plays a major role. What about these places engages you to dwell in the differences between landscapes and the people there?
Yeah, I think just place has emerged as a really important thing for my writing, just because I guess if a poem is on some level an attempt to understand experience, like all of my experiences are somehow framed by the places that I've lived, and I can't even think of my life anymore without thinking about where I was living at the time. And I think, I mean, I also love the outdoors, and I love landscapes, and I love experiencing the world on foot. And so I think that, you know, and when it comes to lived experience, a lot of my lived experiences happen to maybe take place outside. So that's something that I think about a lot. And just because has sort of emerged as, you know, the thing I use to measure my life, or even to locate, you know, a memory, it's always embedded within the environment surrounding it. And I think also just the way that place precedes us and predates us too. I think it's hard for me to imagine that especially because I've only lived, you know, the last few places I've lived, the longest I've lived there has been 3 years. So it's almost impossible for me to imagine that my presence could alter a place. And I'm not trying to like shirk any environmental responsibility with that statement, but just that like I feel so much that the places and the people and the cultures have altered me, as opposed to the other way around. And so I think that is maybe what I'm thinking about when I'm writing, like what has this place done to me or taught me.
And when you say you like to experience a place on foot, I know you're an avid runner. And if I remember right, I think you said before that there is some sort of correlation, you think, between running and writing. I also think it's interesting to consider the idea of the hummingbird in your poems versus like running. And I know you do some long distance running, at least at times.
Yeah.
So like, how do you see that playing into your writing?
That's actually, I'm glad you made that connection, because when I was like thinking about that question of how I write short poems, I was thinking, well, like that doesn't make sense because I'm a long distance runner. I should be more meandering in my work or something like that. But then I remembered that when I was younger, I was more of a sprinter. And then I got to high school and I wasn't built like a sprinter. And, you know, my coach saw me come out of the blocks, like the sprinting blocks. And she was like, yeah, you're not a sprinter. You need to go join the long distance team and go run 5 miles. And I was like, are you kidding me? So I think at heart, like there is something about efficiency and brevity and kind of like experiencing that discomfort and pain all at once, as opposed to kind of extending that pain over a long period of time. But I think that is, you know, my process is more like that of a sprinter's mentality, because I think I'm a sprinter at heart, even though now, it's more efficient to go out and run a few miles at a time, and that's all this old body can take anyway these days.
Well, it's like that old cliche where the poet wants to be a painter, or like
Yeah.
the painter wants to be a writer,
Mm-hmm.
but you're like the painter or the poet or the writer,
Yeah, that's true.
I think I guess I think of it as more of it's nice to have this cross, I don't know how to put it. Not media, but like cross-pollination of different things kind of coming into your body in a way that you kind of share the experience through whatever art form it is that you do.
Yeah.
And speaking of art forms, let us look at the final draft of this poem. I'll bring it up here. And if you could read that for us, please.
Sure. My mother tries to teach me how to garden. On Saturdays, we knelt too. I watched you make holes in the unforgiving New England dirt, then fill them with the seeds you carried like communion. I heard you pray for cooperative weather, then confess you were not a patient woman. This must be why I first confused impatience with hurrying, with impulsive, though unsurprisingly, the root of impatience does not wait. The seed pods burst open if touched. The root of garden is enclosure, and in this way I became like you, leaving home before the first nodding buds of spring. I never busied my hands with beauty. Instead, I taught myself to see the fastened slip stitch of a flower's anther to filament, the ghost apple suspended long after the ice storm departs. Here, in this small southern town, so far from anything I call home, a whole grove flourishes within an abandoned building, restless like a greenhouse that has shaken off its glass.
So this last question is, I don't know, maybe it's one of those questions where I was thinking about your work over time and some of the interests that you have. And so I was thinking about gardens and gardening as being things that are both dear to you and something you don't want to have any part of. Why I Will Never Garden is a poem that is in Rosarium. And we have this poem where your mother is attempting to teach you how to garden, despite your impatience and desire to move around the world, instead of like tending one plot of land, say. So there's that. And then your writing is often steeped in faith, which includes, of course, the origin story of the Garden of Eden. So if this is a question, I don't know, but if poems can be equated to gardens, how do you sow word seeds inside a beautiful and troubled place?
I like this question. It made me think of Marianne Moore's line, imaginary gardens with real toads in them. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with my answer, but that's what the question made me think about. But I think of gardening as an act of faith, especially because of where I grew up. I mean, things do grow in New England, but I just remember gardening being a kind of chore and a kind of like, never really knowing if what you planted would grow or yield anything, right? If there would be enough sun that year, if there would be enough rain that year, because the elements are so inconsistent in New England. They're always changing. Or if, an animal would come along and just help itself, right? And then I think, moving around the country and living in places like California, which, Southern California is a desert, but then there's a lot of, there are a lot of plants that thrive there without much assistance at all or permission, despite, the fact that there's no reason that they should be able to grow at all. But there's something to me about survival in that. And Mississippi too, where, things just grow wildly and out of control. And I think that even if gardening is an act of faith, there also needs to be something to tend it, to care for it, to either to make sure that it does blossom or to make sure that it doesn't spiral out of control. And I think, very much the same about poetry. Like writing is an act of faith. You will sow those word seeds in that beautiful untroubled space, and you have to tend to it, whether it's going to yield anything at all. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Whether it spins out of your control, I think that's an entirely a possibility as well. And I think maybe the shared attitude is patience with both. So I suppose in some ways that writing poems has become my kind of gardening, right? The kind that I'm, most willing to be patient with. Maybe there's, but there's still, only so much control, I think, that we have over language. So.
An excellent answer.
Thank you.
I'm sure where that was going to go, but that was lovely.
That was a great question. So.
Thank you. So Hannah, thank you so much for being with us today. You should definitely check out her book, Rosarium, out on Acre Books, and look for her upcoming book that she's working on now, Studying. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really nice to talk to you. I appreciate it.
You too.